unfactual assertions made upon the floor of the Senate, no matter how they were intended, and we'll make sure that Planned Parenthood can continue to provide the vital services it does in this country. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Be suspended and I be recognized.
Without objection, the senator from Arizona.
After much drama and anticipation late last Friday night, literally minutes before the government was scheduled to shut down, as we all know, a deal was struck to pass a week-long continuing resolution and keep the government operating. That was the 7th continuing resolution we passed since the start of the fiscal year last October. Now we're appearing to consider the 8th and final continuing resolution to fund the government for the remaining 5 months of the fiscal year. Amazing. 8 continuing resolutions were necessary to fund the government for 1 year because my friends on the other side of the aisle neglected to bring a single one of the annual appropriations bill to the floor for consideration last year. As my colleagues know, in addition to continuing funding for all government operations, the measure we will consider tomorrow includes appropriations for the Department of Defense for the remainder of the fiscal year. Unfortunately, on top of the typical run-of-the-mill Washington budget gimmickry, this agreement also contains a gross misallocation of imperative defense resources. The Defense Department funding portion of this bill proposes $513 billion for the routine operations of the Department of Defense and approximately $17 billion in military construction for a total of $530 billion. This amount is $19 billion less than the President's fiscal year 2011 budget request for the Defense Department and its related military construction projects, and $10 billion less than the $540 billion the Secretary of Defense had testified was the minimum amount the Department needed to execute its national defense mission. In addition, this bill also funds an additional $157.8 billion for overseas contingency operations, or war funding, to support our troops in combat consistent with the President's budget request. I might add that the amount Secretary Gates described as essential in January did not foresee that the United States would have expended more than $650 million enforcing the no-fly zone in Libya, an amount that will most likely increase over the remaining months of the fiscal year. While this may seem like a defense funding level that we can live with in a tough fiscal climate, the bill is not what it appears to be on the surface. As the Secretary of Defense pointed out last week, funding to support the warfighter is degraded in this bill because billions in the war funding accounts, my staff has estimated close to $8 billion, have been allocated by the Appropriations Committee for new spending not requested by the administration or transferred to pay items that were originally requested in the base budget for non-war-related expenses. For instance, the bill shifts $3.2 billion in non-war funding to the war funding account to artificially lower defense spending for day-to-day operations, but by doing so reduces funds for the warfighter. Here's an example. The appropriators have added $495 million for 9 additional F-18s and funds them as part of the war funding budget, even though we've not lost any F-18s in the current conflicts. Additionally, the appropriators added $4.8 billion in unrequested funding to the war funding part of the defense bill for programs and activities that the President and Secretary Gates did not seek. For example, $192 million was added for additional missile defense interceptors. There was no administration request for these funds, and missile defense expenses are in no way related to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this bill uses gimmicks and shell games to artificially lower the defense base budget rather than playing by the rules and actually demonstrating our commitment to fiscal responsibility. By doing so, it takes away billions of dollars that were originally requested for ongoing combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan to support our troops where it is most needed. Within the $19 billion lower top line of the base defense budget, this bill continues business as usual, with cuts exceeding $5 billion to the amounts the President and Secretary Gates requested for critical defense programs in order to pay for over $3.7 billion in unjustified and unexplained increases to other accounts. In addition to these shifts away from the Department of Defense priorities, this bill also adds over $1.4 billion for projects that were not requested by the Department and are not considered core activities of the Department of Defense. Let me give you examples of these misallocated resources. It includes $473 million in non-Department of Defense medical research not requested in the President's budget, $227 million in other medical research related to Department of Defense fields but not requested by the Pentagon, $550 million for local roads and schools not requested by the administration. It adds an additional $3.7 billion in program increases not justified by an unfunded request by the service chiefs or by the administration. It adds an unrequested funds for the Red Cross, $24 million, Special Olympics, $1.2 million, youth mentoring programs, $20 million. These are good programs, but they have no place in the Department of Defense. They should be in other areas. Cuts about $1 billion in military construction requested in the President's budget, including $258 million for projects in Bahrain, the headquarters of the Navy's Fifth Fleet. It adds a reporting provision designed to be the first step in forcing the National Guard to buy firefighting aircraft rather than lease commercially available aircraft. It authorizes a multi-year procurement of Navy MH-60 helicopters. I want to be clear here. I know that cancer research is a popular cause on a bipartisan basis and that it has value in the larger scheme of things. I'm not against funding for medical research to fight the scourge of cancer and other diseases. I support funding for these programs that are requested by the administration for the Department of Health and Human Services. But this sort of general medical research funding has no place in a defense bill. Placing it there, which the appropriators have done year after year, undercuts the fiscal responsibility and prioritization process that we expect our federal agencies to undertake when allocating scarce resources. So, the Department of Defense is not only getting a significantly lower amount in its 2011 budget, $19 billion below what it asked for to support its routine operations and carry out its day-to-day national security mission, and $10 billion below what Secretary Gates said in January was essential for the Department's ability to continue to function, but it's also being directed to spend about $8 billion in funding for items that do not directly support the men and women in the military. Let me point out one more disturbing aspect of the DOD portion of this bill. I understand from an exchange between my staff and the staff of the Senate Appropriations Committee that the committee is appropriating only, quote, top-line dollar amounts in this bill and not providing the customary tables, which is the description for each account, which outlines the specifics of what is being funded. Instead, I've learned the committee plans to communicate directly with the Office of the Secretary of Defense on funding levels and specific items. I don't have a problem with the Appropriations Committee providing a top-line dollar amount to the Pentagon and allowing the Secretary of Defense to fund our national security priorities as he sees fit. I am deeply concerned about the lack of transparency associated with this plan, and I hope it's not a way to get around the earmark moratorium currently in place in both houses. If a member of Congress is dictating through the Appropriations Committee the use of scarce defense funds, it's an earmark, even if it was done over the phone. I urge the Department of Defense to not view such communications as law or a mandate. As I noted earlier, in addition to the misallocation of defense resources, this so-called deal uses typical Washington smoke and mirror tactics to achieve savings. According to expert analysis and numerous press reports, the agreement reached by negotiators last week used some of the same budget tricks and gimmickry that have helped us to accumulate our current deficit of $1.4 trillion and a debt of over $14.3 trillion. Yesterday, in an article by Andrew Taylor of the Associated Press, it was reported that details of last week's hard-won agreement to avoid a government shutdown and cut federal spending by $38 billion were released Tuesday morning. They reveal that the budget cuts, while historic, were significantly eased by pruning money left over from previous years, using accounting sleight of hand, and going after programs President Obama had targeted anyway. The article also noted that details of the agreement, quote, reveal a lot of one-time savings and cuts that officially score as cuts to pay for spending elsewhere, but often have little or no impact on the deficit. Additionally, an editorial appeared in today's Wall Street Journal titled, quote, Spending Cut Hokum, GOP Leaders Hype Their Budget Savings, unquote. In part, the editorial states, after separating the accounting gimmicks and one-year savings, the actual cuts look to be closer to $20 billion than to the $38 billion that both sides advertised. But the continuing resolution also saves money on paper through phantom cuts. The Whopper is declaring $6.2 billion in savings by not spending money left from the 2010 census. Congress also cuts $4.9 billion from the Justice Department's crime victim funds, but much of that money was tucked away in a reserve fund that wouldn't have been spent this year in any event. The budgeteers claim $630 million in cuts from what are called, quote, orphan earmarks, or construction that never started, and $2 billion more for transportation projects, some of which were likely to be canceled. The Associated Press reports that $350 million in savings comes from a 2009 program to pay dairy farmers to compensate for low milk prices. Milk prices are higher this year, so some of that money also would never have been spent. An estimated $17 billion come from one-time savings in mandatory program. The cuts are real, but the funding gets restored by law the next year, which means Republicans will have to refight the same battles. States lose some $3.5 billion in bonus money to enroll more kids in the Children's Health Insurance Program, but many states fail to qualify for that extra funding. These cuts don't reduce the spending baseline, so there are no compound savings over time. None of this is enough to defeat the budget at this point, but it is infuriating given the GOP leadership's flogging of that $38 billion top-line figure. Is that the best we can offer the American people right now? In these tough economic times with record debt, deficits, and 8.8% unemployment, an accounting sleight of hand. Our government is bloated and precious taxpayers' dollars are squandered in nearly every agency. You can't pick up a newspaper or go online without seeing reports of waste and duplication throughout federal bureaucracies. I'm pleased some real cuts have been made, but we need to do much more. This deal does not a lot to address the very serious fiscal issues we face as a nation. So I hope that as we address the next crisis, which will be obviously as we reach the debt limit, that we will have more serious plans. And I also believe that it's vitally important, before we raise the debt limit, that we can put this nation on a path to a balanced budget. We cannot afford to continue to borrow 40 cents out of every dollar we spend here in Washington. We cannot afford, as the commercial that many of us have seen on television, have the Chinese own America's money and ours in the United States of America be in such debt that China is an increasing and unhealthy influence on the United States of America. So, Madam President, I intend to vote for this agreement. I believe we could have done a lot better, but at the same time, it's a step in the right direction. It's the first time that we have made serious efforts to reduce spending in quite a number of years around here, and I hope it will serve as something that the American people can support and spur us on to greater efforts in the coming weeks and months. Madam President, notice the presence of the Majority Leader. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
I say to my good friend from Arizona, who we came to the House of Representatives together, came to the Senate together, and Madam President, when we came here determining seniority, we both had the same service, except the state of Arizona had more people than the state of Nevada. So he's one step ahead of me. And I appreciate my friend's statement, Madam President.
I say that to my friend, that's in the eye of the beholder. I thank the Senate.
I appreciate my friend's statement. He and I are both going to vote for this piece of legislation for different reasons, but I am, as I've said publicly and privately, there have been very few people in the history of our country who have served our country so valiantly in battle and in the government as John McCain. And even though we disagree on a number of issues over the years, my admiration for him will always be there. Madam President, we got to change it. Just a second ago, there was a woman there. So, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
As a country learned today, and certainly we learned in Nevada, there was a terrifying close call at the Reno Airport last night. It's a miracle that everyone is okay today. We're grateful that they are. This is what happened. Only one air traffic controller was in the tower during last night's overnight shift. A medical aircraft carrying a critically ill passenger couldn't land because the controller fell asleep. He fell asleep on the job. We now know that the pilot circled several times. We now know that he tried to call the tower not once, not twice, but 7 times. The controller slept through every one of these calls. He slept through this circling of the aircraft. More than 15 minutes later, with a passenger critically ill in the airplane, minutes during which no one could reach the air traffic controller, while this critically ill passenger suffered in that aircraft. The pilot landed without any guidance from the airport. Now, Mr. President, the Reno Airport is situated right below the Great Sierra Nevada Mountains, and it's an extremely difficult place to land. Those of us who have been landing there for all these years, we all know how terribly rough it is many times coming out of there with the winds coming off of the Sierras. And to think that this pilot was forced to land without any controls on the land is very, very scary. This shouldn't happen in Nevada. It shouldn't happen anywhere in our country. It shouldn't happen in any airplane. And it certainly shouldn't happen in an air ambulance or to an air ambulance. I spoke just a short time ago with Secretary of Transportation Ray LaHood. I'm very happy that he's acting, and acting quickly, to make sure this never happens again in Reno or anywhere else in the country. We know we had an experience here a few weeks ago right here in Washington, D.C., the same type of situation. Why did it happen? Reno was one of 27 airports across the country that sometimes had only one air traffic controller on the overnight shift. Because of Secretary LaHood's quick action, there will now be 0. Effective immediately, every airport will have at least 2 air traffic controllers in the tower at any given time. Now, as I indicated, I've flown into that airport and out of that airport many, many times. In October, I was there for a celebration. We're opening a new control tower. It was very badly needed. The old one, you couldn't see parts of the runways. When Reno's old control tower was built, Dwight Eisenhower was president, and the Dodgers were in Brooklyn. In the half-century since then, the area's population has more than tripled. So it was fitting, we said at the time, that the airport opened a control tower 3 times as tall as the old one. But last night's near tragedy reminds us that the state-of-the-art structures and the best technology work only as well as the people operating them. If these people fall asleep on the job, literally, they risk the lives of millions of Americans who fly into and out of airports here in America every day. Secretary LaHood and Randy Babbitt, the FAA administrator, are doing their jobs. I appreciate their responsiveness and share their outrage that this has ever happened. But, Mr. President, Congress also has a key role to play. We have to do our jobs. The Senate passed a bill in February, 2 months ago, to modernize America's air travel. We save or create with that legislation 280,000 jobs. It would improve aviation safety and protect travelers, and that's an understatement. It would even help reduce delays, improve access to rural communities, and it would do all this while creating jobs. The Republican House also passed a companion bill just a few days ago. But the House bill is almost the opposite of ours. It's dangerous. It doesn't protect passengers. It imperils passengers. The Republican bill, we got it from the House, would cut the modern navigation systems at our nation's airport. It's hard to comprehend. An FAA bill, which we've had to give short-term extensions to, I don't know exactly the number of times, but like 14 different times. Now we're going to try to pass a bill that doesn't modernize our navigation systems at our airports. That would be wrong. The FAA said that the House bill would force it to furlough safety-related employees. Not just any employee, those whose primary job is keeping air travel safe. That doesn't make any sense. It would also keep airports from making the infrastructure improvements they need and would completely end the program that ensures rural communities, small towns like Ely, Nevada, have air service. The Senate passed bill and the House passed bill are now in conference to work out the differences. Clearly, there are a lot of differences, and the conferees have some choices to make, and they're important choices. But they need to make them quickly so that both houses can pass this bill and send it to the President and do it quickly. Mr. President, this bill passed here on a huge bipartisan vote. So again, we're grateful that everyone in Reno is okay, but the next time we may not be so fortunate. Let's make our airports and air travel as safe as possible, as soon as possible, so the next time we don't have to rely on luck. And that's what it was. Mr. President, I would note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
It shall be without objection.
Yeah. Mr. President, I suppose I and a lot of my colleagues had an opportunity to hear the President's speech this afternoon. It's very nice that the President is being engaged for the first time in the budget debate and the long-term fiscal problems of this country and the deficit problems of this country. It's good that he is following on with some of the recommendations of his own Deficit Reduction Commission. You have to remember a little less than a year ago he appointed a Deficit Reduction Commission. They reported on December the 5th. It seems that they had broad bipartisan support because the 4 senators that were on there, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and probably very different political philosophies of the 2 of the 4, they have endorsed it. And then all of a sudden, since December the 5th until today, there's just been a lot of quiet on the part of the President of the United States about whether or not he likes what his Deficit Reduction Commission suggested. And I don't know the details of where he's coming from, whether he agrees with every detail that's in the Deficit Reduction Commission recommendations, but at least he is getting on board along the lines of what 64 senators, 32 Republicans and 32 Democrats said in a letter about a month ago to the President. We're ready to start tackling some of these big problems, but we need leadership. And maybe this speech today is an answer to that leadership. Or if I want to be cynical about it, I could say maybe the President gave his speech today because of the very positive comments that Congressman and Chairman Paul Ryan got for his budget ideas that he released last week. But the President also took advantage to renew the class warfare, the demagoguery of taxing the wealthy that doesn't contribute much to the debate. In fact, I think it makes it very difficult to bring people together. Or, if I want to be cynical, I could say this is maybe the President's first speech about his reelection. But either way, I think there's analysis of this that we got to look at very carefully and see, does it really do the economic good that's intended in the speech, even though it's welcome that the President is being engaged at this time. So I would give some reaction to some of the things that the President said. But I want this as background. From World War II through 2009, every dollar of new federal tax revenue coming into this Treasury resulted in $1.17 of new spending. Now just think of that. Every new dollar coming in wasn't a dollar that reduced the deficit. It was a dollar that resulted in $1.17 of additional spending. That's like a dog chasing its tail. It never catches it. And so we are sending a new dollar to Washington to do something about the budget deficit, and nothing really happens as a result of that, except more deficit. The President made the point that tax reductions in 2001 and 2003 added tremendously to the deficit that he inherited, or the part of the deficit that now exists. But in fact, the tax reductions of 2001 and 2003 resulted in more revenue to the Federal Treasury. The expanding economy, spurred by this tax relief acts of 2001 and 2003, helped to reduce the annual budget deficit from $412 billion in 2004 to $160 billion in 2007. Not because we taxed more, but because we taxed less and we had more economic activity as a result of it. Which brings me around to the principle of deficit reduction. Obviously, when I use the word that a dollar additional taxes doesn't go to the bottom line, that doesn't do anything about the deficit. But on the expenditure side, reducing that and the economic growth that comes from it is what reduces the deficit. More economic activity. Even the most sincere arguments that raising taxes will reduce the deficit and the debt doesn't have history to back it up. Outside of Washington, it's obvious to people that the problem isn't that people are undertaxed, but Washington overspends. The voters said this so loud and clear in the last election. And elections are supposed to have consequences. And I think the budget agreement of midnight Friday night is evidence of words from the grassroots of America getting through to Washington, D.C., which I think most people at the grassroots are cynical would ever happen. And I suppose we got to do a lot more to prove to them that there might be a different day in Washington. But it was pretty loud and clear, the results of the last election and the message sent to Washington. Government spending increased by 22% during the last 2 years, an unsustainable level of increased expenditures. If we follow the budget proposed this year by President Obama, we would add another $13 trillion to our national debt over the next decade. This debt gets in the way of economic activity that creates jobs, and it's a terrible burden to leave to future generations. We talk dollars and cents when we talk about the deficit and the debt, but it's a moral issue of whether or not those of us of our generation ought to live high in the hog and leave the bill to young people like these pages here that have to pick up for it. It's a moral issue as much as it is an economic issue. This trillions of dollars of debt gets in the way of the economic activity that creates jobs. And it's a terrible burden on future generations. Washington needs to get behind policies that clamp down on spending, and as a result, we will grow the economy. Increased economic activity increases revenue to the Federal Treasury, enabling deficit and debt reduction. And we know that from a fact because from 97 to the year 2000, we actually, because of the growth of the economy, paid down I believe it was $568 billion on the national debt during that period of time. The answer is not defending ways to grow government. Grow the economy, but you don't grow the economy by growing government. Getting back to the issue of the President making a big deal in his speech about the 2001 tax cuts being a major cause of the budget deficit, and probably the implication of the unfairness of it because there wasn't higher taxes on higher income people, I would suggest that the President is wrong in both regards. In 2001, tax cut included an across-the-board income tax rate reduction and reduced the tax rates on the lowest income people from 15% to 10%. And it resulted in removing millions of low-income people from the federal income tax rolls entirely. It increased the child tax credit from $500 to $1,000. The legislation included marriage penalty relief and the first ever tax deduction for tuition. 2 years later, after 9/11, the 2003 dividends and capital gains tax rate cuts spurred economic growth and created jobs. The result was more revenue to the federal treasury, not less. The expanding economy helped reduce the annual budget deficit, and I'm repeating these numbers because they're significant, from $412 billion in 2005 to $160 billion in 2007. I know it's counterintuitive to a lot of people to hear a member of the Senate say, you reduce marginal tax rates, you're going to bring revenue into the federal treasury, because the obvious common sense tells people that if you increase taxes, you're going to bring in more revenue. But as I said earlier in the speech today, it doesn't work out that way, because there's some people in this country can decide, you know, I'm paid enough taxes. I'm not going to pay more. So they disincentivize to be productive, probably do leisure or invest in non-productive activity. In your lower marginal tax rates, it encourages those people to be productive, and in the way of being productive, at the same time creating jobs, growing the economy, bringing more money into the federal treasury. When you look at the sources of the deficit, contrary to the President's claims, tax relief has been a small part. Unprecedented spending contributed much more to the deficit than the tax relief did, and particularly in the last 2 years, a 22% increase in expenditures on top of the $814 billion deficit. $814 billion stimulus. Now, here's something that's probably counterintuitive too as well, and probably something the President misses from his analysis of the 2001 and 2003 tax relief bills that he blames the big budget deficit on. The tax rates, those reductions, actually ended up with taxes being more progressive. The effective federal tax rate on the top 1% of the households is more than 7 times the rate paid by the bottom 20% of the households. And that's up from less than 5 times as much in the year 1979. If tax relief enacted since 2001 is allowed to expire in a little more than a year and a half, because last December we only extended the existing tax policy till December 31st, 2012, at that time, if that happens, a family of 4 with 2 kids who earn $50,000 today would see a $2,000 $155 increase in its tax bill. More than 6 million low-income people who currently have no federal income tax liability would be subject to the individual income tax, and that would be at a rate of 15% instead of now 10%. Washington needs to learn that leaving more money in the pockets of the taxpayers unleashes a positive chain reaction in our economy. On the other hand, government spending doesn't create wealth because government is not an institution that can create wealth. Government's an institution that can only provide an environment for people outside of the government to create wealth. And in fact, what the government does is it consumes wealth and as a result doesn't generate a stronger economy. Instead of growing the government, Washington needs to focus on helping create private sector jobs. The President's new plan will reduce the deficit by $4 trillion over 12 years. He does that by reducing spending by $2 trillion, but raising taxes by $1 trillion, and thus lowering interest payments by $1 trillion. The President again failed to realize that we do not have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. Now, at least a couple times since I've been in the United States Senate, I've heard this argument, well, let's increase taxes $1 and we'll reduce expenditures $2 or $3 or $4. Sometimes it's $2, sometimes it's $3, sometimes it's $4 behind those ideas. Now, that sounds very good, doesn't it? But here's why it doesn't work and why bringing in $1 of new taxes actually leads to spending of $1.17, as Professor Vedder, V-E-D-D-E-R, of Ohio University has studied this. Because you increase taxes for a long, long period of time. In fact, you increase taxes until you decide to do something else with the taxes. But appropriations are reviewed annually. And for some reason or other, after that first year, appropriations tend to creep up and creep up and creep up. And consequently, the well-intention of raising taxes $1 and reducing expenditures by $3 or $4, as well-intended as it just gradually is eroded on the expenditure side. That's that half of that proposition, so that you end up not reducing expenditures as you had originally indicated. I yield the floor, Mr. President, and I suggest the absence of a